What would you do if the person you loved more than anything in the world betrayed you in the worst possible way? How far would you go if your trust was shattered, your heart broken beyond repair? Could you control the rage that burned inside you, or would it consume you entirely? In the story that follows, a man finds himself facing these exact questions after discovering an unspeakable betrayal, when he found out that his girlfriend not just cheated him with one man but 20 of them. Driven by overwhelming emotions, he commits a crime so brutal that it changes his life forever. Was he justified in his actions, or did he lose himself in the heat of the moment? As you delve into this tale of passion, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of uncontrolled anger, ask yourself, what would you have done in his place? Would you have acted differently, or would the darkness within you have taken over? This story will challenge your perceptions of right and wrong, love and revenge, and the fine line that separates them. The rain poured heavily outside, drumming against the window of a small, dimly lit apartment. Inside, Alexa Hayes sat on the edge of her bed, staring blankly at the wall. Her long, dark hair hung loosely around her face, framing eyes that were a storm of confusion and longing. At 24, Alexa was strikingly beautiful, with a magnetic presence that drew people to her effortlessly. But beneath her captivating exterior lay a turbulent soul, one that was in constant search of something she couldn't quite grasp. Alexa had always been different. As a teenager, she noticed that her desires were more intense than those of her friends. While they were content with fleeting kisses and innocent flirtations, Alexa craved more. The intensity of her yearning scared her at first, but she quickly learned to embrace it, to channel it into the whirlwind of her relationships. But no matter how passionate the affair, how thrilling the encounter, the satisfaction was always fleeting. Her hunger for intimacy was insatiable, a fire that refused to be extinguished. She floated from one relationship to another, each more intense than the last, but none could quench the burning within her. She tried to find solace in the arms of different men, hoping that each new experience would fill the void. But it never did. Each lover was a temporary fix, a bandage over a wound that never healed. The thrill of the chase, the excitement of new connections, gave her temporary relief, but the restlessness always returned, gnawing at her, pushing her to seek out more. Her friends often marveled at her beauty and charm, but they didn't know the truth. They didn't know that behind her confident smile was a woman who was lost, desperate, and spiraling out of control. Alexa couldn't understand why she felt this way. She had everything: looks, intelligence, and a promising future, but something was missing, something she couldn't name. It was as if there was a hole inside her, an emptiness that no amount of physical connection could fill. Her addiction to sex was not something she spoke about. It was a secret she kept buried deep within her, a dark side she didn't fully understand. She wasn't clear about it herself, only knowing that she needed it, that it was the only thing that brought her a semblance of peace, however fleeting. But as the years went by, the emptiness grew larger, the need more consuming. Tonight, as the rain fell harder, Alexa felt the familiar stirrings of restlessness. She had ended things with her latest boyfriend just days before, another relationship that had started with passion and ended in disappointment. He had been perfect on paper, handsome, successful, and deeply in love with her. But as always, it wasn't enough. Alexa's desires had overwhelmed her once again, driving her to seek out something more, something darker. She remembered him, Ryan. He was a hunk, the kind of man who turned heads wherever he went. His chiseled jawline, broad shoulders, and piercing blue eyes had captivated her from the moment they met. At first, Ryan had been everything she wanted. He knew how to touch her, how to make her feel alive. For a while, Alexa thought that maybe, just maybe, he could be the one to tame the fire inside her. But the peace was temporary. The more he tried to satisfy her, the more her desires grew, until even he couldn't keep up. The tension between them had built slowly, like a storm brewing on the horizon. Ryan had sensed her growing dissatisfaction, the way her eyes wandered even when they were together. He tried to hold on, to give her everything he could, but it wasn't enough. Alexa's mind was already elsewhere, craving new experiences, new thrills. It wasn't long before she began to stray. At first, it was just flirtations, innocent enough, but soon she was meeting other men, seeking out the excitement that had faded in her relationship with Ryan. The guilt gnawed at her, but the thrill of the forbidden was too strong to resist. She was addicted to the rush, to the feeling of being desired by multiple men, of having them all want her. Then came the night at the Dirty Cinema. It was a place she had heard about in whispers, a seedy underground establishment where anything could happen. The idea had intrigued her, tantalized her with its promise of danger and anonymity. She had gone there on impulse, driven by a need she didn't fully understand. When she arrived, the darkness of the place enveloped her, the air thick with the scent of sweat and lust. Alexa had hesitated for a moment, but the restlessness inside her was too strong. She needed this. She needed to lose herself completely. And so, she had presented herself to the room, offering her body to whoever wanted it. The men had come to her, one after another, and Alexa had let them, surrendering to the frenzy, to the raw, primal desire that consumed her. For a brief moment, she felt free, unburdened by the weight of her addiction. But even as she gave herself over to them, a part of her knew this peace wouldn't last. Now, sitting on her bed, Alexa could still feel the remnants of that night clinging to her skin. She had found a temporary relief, but the emptiness was already creeping back in, the restlessness stirring once more. She didn't know how to break free from this cycle, didn't know how to escape the addiction that was slowly consuming her. As she lay down, the sound of the rain lulling her into a fitful sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. Ryan had been calling her, leaving messages that she didn't want to hear. She knew she had hurt him, knew he deserved better than what she could give. But she couldn't help herself. She couldn't stop. Little did she know, the night at the cinema was only the beginning of her descent. The darkness was closing in, and soon there would be no escape. The sun streamed through the windows of a quaint cafe on the corner of Maple Street, casting a warm glow over the wooden tables and the soft hum of conversation. Alexa sat at a corner table, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She had come here hoping to find some semblance of peace, to quiet the storm that raged within her. It had been days since the night at the Dirty Cinema, and the memory of what she had done still haunted her, a dark shadow that refused to fade. She hadn't seen Ryan since then. Guilt and shame had kept her away, but the emptiness inside her had only grown stronger. She missed him, missed the way he looked at her with such adoration, as if she were the only woman in the world. He had been good to her, too good. Despite everything, Alexa wanted to make things right, to find solace in his arms once more. As she sat there, lost in thought, a strange sensation crept over her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she felt the unmistakable weight of someone's gaze on her. Alexa glanced up, her eyes scanning the room until they locked onto a man sitting a few tables away. He was staring at her intently, a smirk playing on his lips, as if he knew something she didn't. Alexa's heart skipped a beat. She recognized him instantly, one of the men from the cinema. Her breath caught in her throat as a wave of panic washed over her. How had he found her? What did he want? She forced herself to look away, trying to ignore the rising dread that settled in the pit of her stomach. But the man's gaze was relentless, boring into her with a disturbing intensity. She could feel his eyes on her, as if he were undressing her with his mind, remembering the way she had surrendered to him and the others that night. The door to the cafe swung open, and Ryan walked in, his presence a welcome distraction from the man's unsettling stare. Alexa's heart lifted at the sight of him, and she waved him over, grateful for the reprieve. Ryan smiled as he approached, but there was a tension in his posture that Alexa couldn't ignore. As he sat down across from her, she noticed the slight furrow in his brow, the way his jaw was clenched as if he were holding something back. "Hey," she said softly, reaching out to take his hand. "I'm glad you came." Ryan squeezed her hand but didn't return her smile. His eyes flicked to the man who was still staring at Alexa, and a flash of anger crossed his face. "Who's that guy?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Alexa's heart raced. She shook her head, trying to act nonchalant. "I don't know. He's just some guy, I guess." Ryan wasn't convinced. He turned in his seat, his gaze hardening as he met the man's eyes. "Is there a problem?" he demanded, his voice cold. The man leaned back in his chair, a smug grin spreading across his face. "No problem," he replied, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Just enjoying the view." Ryan's eyes darkened with anger, and before Alexa could react, he was out of his seat, striding over to the man's table. "You got something to say?" he growled, towering over him. The man chuckled, clearly unfazed by Ryan's aggression. Relax, man. I'm just admiring your girlfriend. She's quite unforgettable. Ryan's fist clenched at his side, and Alexa could see the barely restrained fury in his eyes. Keep your eyes to yourself, he warned, his voice low and dangerous. The man held up his hands in mock surrender. All right, no need to get all worked up. Alexa quickly got up from her seat and grabbed Ryan's arm, pulling him away. Ryan, please, let's just go, she pleaded, her voice trembling. Ryan hesitated for a moment, his gaze still locked on the man, before finally allowing Alexa to lead him out of the cafe. As they stepped outside, the tension in the air was palpable. Ryan's jaw was still clenched, his eyes blazing with anger. What the hell was that about, he demanded, turning to face her. Alexa shook her head, trying to calm him down. I don't know, Ryan. He's just some creep. Forget about him. Ryan stared at her, searching her face for answers. Are you sure? Because it seemed like he knew you. Alexa's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't tell him the truth, couldn't admit that the man was part of her darkest secret. I'm sure she lied, forcing a smile. Let's just forget about it, okay? Ryan nodded reluctantly, but the doubt in his eyes was clear. They walked in silence back to Alexa's apartment, the tension between them growing with each step. Once inside, Ryan finally spoke, his voice tinged with frustration. Alexa, I feel like you're not telling me something. What's going on? Alexa's mind raced, searching for the right words. She knew she couldn't keep lying to him, but the truth was too ugly, too shameful. I've just been feeling a little off lately, she said, avoiding his gaze. I'm sorry if I've been distant. Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I just want to help, Alexa. I care about you. His words cut through her, filling her with guilt. Ryan was the only man who had ever truly cared for her, and she was about to lose him. She wanted to tell him everything, to beg for his forgiveness, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she leaned in and kissed him, hoping to erase the distance between them, to drown out the guilt and fear with the familiarity of his touch. Ryan kissed her back, but there was a hesitance to his movements, a lingering doubt that he couldn't shake. They spent the rest of the evening together, trying to reclaim the connection they once had, but the tension remained, a silent barrier between them. Later that night, Ryan left Alexa's apartment, promising to see her the next day. But as he walked away, a nagging suspicion gnawed at him. Something wasn't right, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Alexa was hiding something from him. When Ryan got home, he decided to distract himself by browsing the internet. He absent-mindedly scrolled through social media until a notification caught his eye. It was a message from a friend, a link attached with a cryptic note, "You need to see this." Curious, Ryan clicked on the link, his eyes narrowing as the page loaded. What he saw next made his blood run cold. The video was grainy, the quality poor, but there was no mistaking what it was: a recording of Alexa at the dirty cinema, surrounded by men. The scene was graphic, explicit, and utterly devastating. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest as he watched in disbelief. His hands shook, and his mind raced, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. The woman in the video wasn't the Alexa he knew, the Alexa he loved. This was someone else entirely, a stranger with a darkness he hadn't seen before. Rage boiled within him, a primal anger that he had never felt before. His vision blurred with fury as he slammed his laptop shut and grabbed his phone. He dialed Alexa's number with trembling fingers, his mind a whirlwind of emotions: betrayal, disgust, heartbreak. When she answered, her voice was soft, unsuspecting. Ryan? Is everything okay? Ryan's voice was cold, barely restrained. I saw it, Alexa. I saw the video. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, and Ryan could hear her sharp intake of breath. Ryan, Don't, he cut her off, his voice shaking with anger. How could you do this? How could you lie to me? Tears welled up in Alexa's eyes as she tried to find the words. Ryan, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for you to find out like this. Shut up, Ryan shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. You disgust me, Alexa. I can't even look at you right now. Please, Ryan. Let me explain. But Ryan wasn't listening. The betrayal was too deep, the pain too raw. Without another word, he hung up, throwing his phone across the room in a fit of rage. He paced his apartment, his mind racing, his heart breaking. The woman he loved had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and the anger that consumed him was blinding. He couldn't think, couldn't see past the images burned into his mind. All he knew was that he had to confront her, had to make her understand the pain she had caused. In a haze of fury, Ryan grabbed his keys and stormed out of his apartment, the rage driving him to the brink. As he sped through the streets, his mind was a blur, a cacophony of thoughts and emotions that he couldn't control. By the time he reached Alexa's apartment, his hands were shaking, his breathing ragged. He burst through the door, his eyes wild with anger. Alexa stood in the living room, her face pale, her eyes filled with fear. "Ryan, please." But he didn't listen. The pain and betrayal overwhelmed him, clouding his judgment, driving him to the edge. The last thing he remembered was the look of terror in her eyes, the sound of his own voice screaming in anguish. And then everything went black. He had driven here in a blind rage, the images from the video seared into his mind, a grotesque loop of the woman he loved submitting to strangers. The Alexa he knew, the woman who had captured his heart, seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by this dark, twisted stranger who had shattered his world. Alexa was standing in the living room, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She knew he had seen the video. His voice on the phone had been enough to confirm that. But seeing him now, the raw anger in his eyes, made her realize that there was no escape, no way to undo the damage she had caused. "Ryan, please. Let me explain," she pleaded, her voice shaking as she took a step back, the walls of her apartment closing in on her. Ryan's eyes were wild, a storm of emotions swirling within them: anger, hurt, betrayal, and something darker, something that scared even him. "Explain," he spat, his voice venomous. "What is there to explain, Alexa? You hoard yourself out to strangers. You betrayed me in the worst possible way, and now you want to explain." Tears streamed down Alexa's face as she tried to reach out to him, to touch him, to bridge the gap that had grown between them. "I'm sorry, Ryan. I didn't mean to hurt you. I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm so lost, so confused." Ryan recoiled from her touch as if it burned him. The sight of her, the woman who had once been his everything, now filled him with nothing but rage. "You're lost," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "You're confused? And what about me, Alexa? What about the man who loved you, who trusted you? What about the pain you've caused me? Did you even think about that while you were spreading your legs for every man who came near you?" Alexa sobbed, her whole body trembling as she tried to find the words, the excuses, anything to make this right. But there was nothing she could say that would erase what she had done, nothing that could heal the wound she had inflicted on the man she loved. "Ryan, I'm begging you, please forgive me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll do anything to make this right." But Ryan was beyond reason. The rage had taken hold of him, and all he could think about was making her feel the same pain he was feeling, to tear her apart the way she had torn him apart. Without warning, he lunged at her, his hands gripping her arms with a force that made her cry out in pain. "Ryan, stop. Please, you're hurting me," Alexa screamed, trying to push him away, but he was too strong, too consumed by his fury to listen. He shoved her onto the couch, his breathing ragged, his eyes burning with an intensity that terrified her. "You want to be a whore, Alexa? Fine. I'll treat you like one," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Alexa's heart pounded in her chest as she realized what he was about to do. "No, Ryan, please don't," she pleaded, but her words were cut off as he pinned her down, his hands rough and unforgiving. There was no tenderness in his touch, no love, only rage. He tore at her clothes, his movements violent and harsh, ignoring her cries for mercy, for forgiveness. In his mind, she deserved this, she had brought it on herself. Every gasp of pain, every tear that fell from her eyes only fueled his anger further, driving him to exact his vengeance on her. Ryan forced himself on her, his actions brutal and merciless. He took her with a savage intensity, the rawness of his emotions spilling out in every harsh thrust. Alexa sobbed beneath him, her body racked with pain, but he didn't care. He couldn't care. This was his retribution, his way of punishing her for the betrayal, for the humiliation, for the destruction of everything they once had. As he continued, the room was filled with the sounds of her cries, her desperate pleas for him to stop. But Ryan was lost in his rage, unable to see beyond his own pain. He hit her once, twice, his hand connecting with her face with a force that made her see stars. Alexa's screams grew weaker, her strength fading as he continued to assault her, his anger pushing him further and further into the darkness. Time seemed to blur as the violence escalated, the lines between love and hate, pleasure and pain, becoming indistinguishable. Ryan's mind was a haze, a swirling vortex of emotion that he couldn't control. He wanted to stop, to pull back, but the anger, the betrayal, was too much. All he could think about was making her hurt as much as he was hurting. Finally, as Alexa's cries grew faint, her body limp beneath him, a sliver of clarity broke through the fog of rage that had consumed him. He looked down at her, at the bruises already forming on her pale skin, at the blood that smeared her lips, and felt a surge of horror at what he had done. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, crashing down on him with the weight of his own actions. Ryan stumbled back, his chest heaving as he stared at her, at the lifeless body of the woman he had loved more than anything. Alexa lay still, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow and labored. The sight of her, so broken and fragile, was like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath out of him. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice trembling with fear and regret. He reached out, his hands shaking as he touched her face, but there was no response. The silence was deafening, the reality of what he had done crashing down on him all at once. He had killed her. In his blind rage, in his need to make her pay, he had taken her life. Ryan's heart raced as panic set in. He backed away from her, his mind racing with thoughts of what he should do next. He had to get out of here, had to escape before anyone found out. He couldn't go to prison, couldn't face the consequences of what he had done. Without another thought, Ryan turned and fled, leaving Alexa's lifeless body behind. He ran down the stairs, out into the night, his mind a whirlwind of fear and desperation. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care. All that mattered was getting as far away from here as possible. As he drove away, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white, Ryan tried to process what had just happened. He had killed the woman he loved, the woman he had planned to spend the rest of his life with. The reality of it was too much to bear, too overwhelming. But as the miles stretched on and the city lights faded into the distance, Ryan knew that there was no escape from what he had done. The darkness that had consumed him, the anger that had driven him to kill, would follow him wherever he went. And no matter how far he ran, he would never be free from the guilt, the regret, the haunting memory of Alexa's lifeless eyes staring back at him. And so, Ryan kept driving, the weight of his actions pressing down on him with every passing moment, knowing that his life would never be the same again. The next morning, police discovered Alexa's body after a concerned neighbor reported strange noises the previous night. The scene inside the apartment was chaotic, with signs of a violent struggle. The forensic team meticulously collected evidence, including DNA samples from Alexa's body, and noted the disturbing state of the room. A crucial breakthrough came when investigators found Alexa's phone, revealing a recent call to her boyfriend, Ryan. DNA analysis confirmed his presence, leading to his swift arrest at a nearby motel. He was found in a disheveled state, clearly shaken and panicked. Ryan's trial attracted significant public attention due to the shocking nature of the crime. The prosecution presented a clear narrative of a man driven to brutal violence by the discovery of his girlfriend's betrayal. They relied heavily on the DNA evidence, detailed forensic reports, and the testimony of the neighbor who had found Alexa's body. The defense did not dispute Ryan's presence at the scene or the DNA evidence, but focused on his emotional state at the time. They argued that Ryan had been deeply hurt and acted out of overwhelming grief and anger, not premeditation. The defense sought to reduce the charges, suggesting manslaughter rather than first-degree murder, citing his emotional turmoil. After weeks of intense testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict guilty of first-degree murder and aggravated rape. The courtroom was tense as the verdict was read, sealing Ryan's fate. In the sentencing phase, the prosecution pushed for the harshest penalty, arguing the brutality of the crime demanded it. The defense, acknowledging Ryan's guilt, pleaded for leniency, citing his emotional state and remorse. However, the judge delivered a severe sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ryan's actions were deemed inexcusable, and the punishment reflected the gravity of his crime. The realization of his fate hit him hard as he faced the rest of his life in prison, haunted by the memory of what he had done and the life he had destroyed.